This is Jim Long. In this presentation, I'll be talking about the Dyers Creek Massacre of 1787, an event that occurred in the earliest days of European settlement in northern Middle Tennessee. I'll talk about who John Dyer was, who was involved in the event of 1787, what actually happened, and where it happened. I will be telling you where the event took place at the end of this video. The event took place, generally speaking, in modern-day Stewart County, but most of the people involved were either residents of Clarksville or Nashville, both of which were very young cities at the time. Some of the sources that I've used in pulling together this presentation: the Draper manuscripts, which is a huge collection assembled by Lyman Draper of New York, who is associated with the Wisconsin Historical Society. Mr. Draper set out to document the heroes of the southern part of the American Revolution. Most of his works go from the 1750s to about 1815. Most of the collection are his notes and correspondence as he was compiling all of this information. In particular, for this story, I'm using an 1843 interview that he conducted with Hugh Ferguson Bell of Clarksville. Judge John Haywood also wrote The Civil and Political History of Tennessee, 1843, in which he mentions the event. Ramsey's Annals of 1853 also mention the Dyers Creek Massacre, and as well the circuit court records at the Stewart County Archives will come into play, as we'll see. And land grants. I'll be talking quite a bit here at the beginning about how the land grant process worked and how that affected what happened and the aftermath of what happened. So the land grant process as it existed in 1787 was a bit complicated. I'm going to oversimplify it here for you, but North Carolina was paying its veterans of the Rev War with land in what would later be Tennessee. They set up a military reservation in what is now northern Middle Tennessee, from which it would use to award land to its veterans in lieu of actual money. So the veteran had to obtain a warrant proving that they were entitled to choose some land out of this military reservation. At the time, it was called Davidson County, North Carolina. Once the veteran had a warrant entitled him to a certain acreage, he would locate a particular piece of land in the military reservation, and he would go to the land office in Nashville to do that, and he would make an entry on a specific piece of land. So you have a warrant, a location, and an entry involved. And then before the grant could be issued, the land actually had to be surveyed, and so they had to send surveying teams out to each of these parcels of land. This is a gross oversimplification of the land grant process. Most veterans of North Carolina sold their warrants early in the process because they had no intention of moving to the frontier, as this certainly was in the 1780s. The process I've oversimplified here was rife with fraud as well. Mostly the people got the wrong land, not so much that people got more land than they were entitled to, but they didn't necessarily get the land they thought they were getting. A lot of the veterans sold their warrants to speculators, and speculators made good money off of this process. So the surveying process itself, these tracts of land that had to be surveyed in order for grants to be issued, the land was surveyed by what's called meets and bounds. You see for reference here a couple of ways that meets and bounds can be described. Say you have a creek here, and there may be certain boundaries of this plot of land that needs to be surveyed. There might be a rock on the creek bank, there might be an oak tree, there might be a hill where a spring is flowing from. You'll also see directions and distances coming into play with meets and bounds surveying. You might see a call for north 45 degrees east for a distance of 500 feet, for example. The surveying crews measured these distances 66 feet at a time. They had a chain that was 66 feet long, which was 4 poles, a pole being 16.5 feet. So 66 feet at a time, they had to take this chain from point to point along a given line in a given direction to measure and complete a piece of land that was up for being granted. So for example, I'll show you an example here. The different colors that I show you here are different parcels of land. And let's say we have this red rectangle here that starts at a red oak and hickory. It goes south for 400 poles to 2 white oaks, and then it goes west 400 poles. It goes north 400 poles crossing a creek. It goes east 400 poles back to the beginning, passing a spring along the way. And adjacent to that was another piece of land maybe that was surveyed. It would start at the same red oak and hickory, but it would go south only 320 poles, and as you can see on around for complement. And so this red oak and hickory is involved in both pieces of land. And then you might have another blue rectangle down here that adjoined the red rectangle. It was important to make these measurements precise so that the land did not overlap. And maybe you even have a little fourth yellow square here. And so, for example, this red oak and hickory became very important in a surveying process for this area, because each time, to make sure they got it right, they would start out at the same tree, even if they were coming off to measure this yellow square. They might have to go back up to this red oak and hickory and measure off the distances to make sure they were starting at the right corner, to make sure that these surveys didn't overlap. In this scenario, this red oak and hickory becomes the key corner for this whole series of surveys along this creek, because it was the key to all of the surveys. You needed a handful of people to do this kind of surveying. You had chain carriers who were carrying that 66-foot chain. You had people cutting weeds and cane and trees out of the way if they were in the way of the surveying. Of course, you had cooks, you had guards. This was frontier, this was Native American country, and so the surveyors had that to deal with as well. And so you had a support crew along with the actual deputy surveyor or chief surveyor. But this example is not just a theoretical example. This is the example I want to talk to you about for the Dyers Creek Massacre. The red rectangle I talked to you here about was the land grant of a man named James Cole Montflorence. It was a 1,000-acre tract that he was in the process of being granted that did begin at a red oak and hickory, and it did cross this creek, and it was adjacent to a spring. This piece of land was eventually recorded in Stewart County Deed Book B in 1807. The creek was called Spring Creek below the blooming grove, and the deed book even says the creek where a party of surveyors was defeated in November 1787. James Cole Montflorence was a Revolutionary War veteran himself, but he was also a deputy surveyor here in this military district of Middle Tennessee. He lived in Nashville. He was closely aligned with the Blunt family, and the Blunts were political movers and shakers in early Tennessee. They were also land speculators. Some people mistakenly, when they see this Blooming Grove reference, they think it's referencing Blooming Grove Creek in Montgomery County, when in fact what it's referencing is upstream of this creek was a grove of trees called a Blooming Grove. It's on a creek that was initially called Green Tree Grove Creek, and now is typically known on maps as Noah's Spring Branch. What was going on in 1787 before the Dyers Creek Massacre took place? Chickasaw had executed a Treaty of Nashboro, so-called, in 1783. They had ceded to North Carolina all the lands between the Duck River and the Cumberland River, shown here on this map. You can see most of the military reservation was between those two creeks. So they had agreed to cede that land in 1783. However, in violation of the treaty in the summer of 1787, the Creek village of Coldwater near Florence, Alabama had been burned and the leader killed. And so in retaliation for that and other issues involving with the European settlement, the Creeks increased their attacks on the settlements in the Cumberland River Valley. In 1787, when the massacre took place, Clarksville, Tennessee was only 3 years old. It would be another 8 years after the massacre before anyone even settled in Stewart County. So very much the frontier when these surveying parties were going along the military reservation and surveying these grants that needed to be issued. And certainly the western part of that reservation was frontier land for sure. Who was John Dyer? John Dyer was known in his time as a buffalo hunter and trader. He spoke the Creek and Chickasaw languages perfectly. According to General James Robertson, the founder of Nashville, Robertson was trying to get John Dyer to come to Nashville and help him work with the Native Americans, but Dyer preferred a quieter life, perhaps. He stayed in Clarksville. But he was one of the first people to settle in Stewart County. He lived in a cabin near the mouth of what we now call Dyers Creek, across the river from present-day Dover. The cabin was either at the mouth of the creek or maybe on Dover Island, which was originally called Dyers Island. John Dyer was a chain carrier for some of the surveying parties in the couple of years preceding the Dyers Creek Massacre. But he was not in the surveying party that was even involved in the Dyers Creek Massacre. So it's a misnomer to think that he died at the Dyers Creek Massacre, but the creek was obviously named for him a little bit later. John Dyer was actually killed in 1793, 6 years after the massacre. He was on a hunting trip just north of Clarksville and was killed. And it was some point after 1793 when he was killed that the creek was renamed for him, what we now know as Dyers Creek. Let me tell you about who was in the surveying party that was involved in the Dyers Creek Massacre. You had Anthony Foster of Nashville. He was a deputy surveyor for the military district, with Martin Armstrong being the chief surveyor. You had Major George Steele, a man named William Martin. You had another surveyor named James Ierson. You had a man named Peter Barnett, who's only been described in the history books as a mulatto. You had William Crutcher, who was an early settler in Nashville. You had a man named William Nash, who was in early Davidson County tax list, so he was a resident of Nashville. And then the history that records this massacre refers to 2 chain carriers just arrived from North Carolina. So you have these 7 men plus 2 additional chain carriers, so a surveying party of 9 men involved in the Dyers Creek Massacre. Another person of interest that we'll hear about was Hugh Ferguson Bell. His father, George Bell, had moved to Clarksville in his infancy and had built what was known as Bell Station, or Bell's Blockhouse. Bell Station overlooked the Red River. It's probably in the vicinity of Craft Street. If you know Clarksville, maybe about where Frosty Morn sits. But I'm not sure the location of Bell Station is known today. Hugh Bell was married to Mary Montgomery, a sister of John Montgomery, for whom Montgomery County was named. So Hugh Bell was an early settler of Clarksville. He was living in Clarksville at the time of the Dyers Creek Massacre, but he was not in the surveying party, but he was in the rescue party. It was Hugh Bell who gave the interview to Lyman Draper in the 1840s, giving him the detail about the Dyers Creek Massacre that I'm sharing with you today. So let's talk about the attack. The surveying party was surveying this 1,000-acre grant that was in the process of being granted to James Colmont Florence. They had started at the Red Oak and Hickory, the key corner, which was about 200 feet east of the spring on the creek that at the time was known as Spring Creek because of the spring. They had surveyed the eastern line, starting at the Red Oak and Hickory, going south 400 poles to the 2 White Oaks. They had done that pretty much the first day, and almost everybody made it back to the camp at the spring except for Anthony Foster, the deputy surveyor, and the 2 unnamed chain carriers. They got lost and they didn't make their way back into the camp, which is probably fortunate for them. According to Lyman Draper's manuscripts in the Draper's Notes section, at daybreak the second day, Native American party fired upon the surveying camp. They wounded George Steele, James Ierson, and Peter Barnett. Martin and Nash ran off together and were pursued for a little while, but they both escaped unhurt, whereas Steele, Ierson, and Barnett all died of their injuries. So at this point we have 3 men dead, 2 men who have escaped, but we have those chain carriers who got lost, so don't forget about them. William Crutcher has a little story unto himself. He was shot while fleeing the camp, and his arm got broke as probably a result of the gunshot. He hid in some cane brakes, pretended to be dead. A Native American came up and stabbed him under the arm in one side, leaving the knife in the body so as to claim the scalp, so it says, as his, and he was going to come back later and scalp because he thought Crutcher was dead. But Crutcher was alive, and he crept through the canebrake and made his way back to the camp after the attack, supposedly only then discovering the knife, so perhaps it wasn't a huge knife, or he was in so much pain from everything else going on he didn't know it. But he did survive, and he kept that knife for years thereafter. So at this point, we have Steele, Ireson, and Barnett are dead. Martin, Crutcher, and Nash have survived. But Anthony Foster and the two chain carriers who got lost the night before, we haven't heard from them. Well, Foster and the two chain carriers that had gotten lost the night before and hadn't made it back to camp did make it back to camp about an hour after the attack, and they found William Crutcher there wounded with a knife in his arm. Anthony Foster, who was the deputy surveyor, set out for Bell Station in Clarksville, leaving the two chain carriers to tend to the wounded William Crutcher. But Foster got lost, so on the second day, Crutcher and the two chain carriers, no one's come to rescue them or help. They assume that Foster himself has met some sort of bad fate, so they decide to set out to Clarksville themselves. It was a 30-mile trip. Crutcher was wounded. And so it took them 2 days to get back to Clarksville to get William Crutcher some attention. When Anthony Foster did arrive, because he didn't get lost, when he arrived at Bell Station, he did get a rescue party organized, including Hugh F. Bell, John Brantley, John Newell. They set out to what was, for years thereafter, described as the defeated camp. Meanwhile, William Crutcher and the two unnamed chain carriers had left a charcoal note for them at the camp, explaining that they themselves had set out for Clarksville. And so the rescue party, Foster, Bell, Brantley, and Newell, buried the 3 dead men there at the defeated camp. Lyman Draper's manuscripts was not the only source for this event, though. We have some other versions of the attack. Judge John Haywood says basically the same version, but and the same casualties. But he says that William Crutcher had laid in the fork of a fallen tree instead of in canebrakes to escape capture. Ramsay's Annals, 1853, just mentions Ireson and Barnett as being killed, but not necessarily Steele. So this camp, the site of the Dyers Creek Massacre, was forever known, for many years known, not forever known, as the defeated camp. And the Spring Creek, at the time the creek was called Spring Creek. It took place in 1787, but it was 2 years later before the grants were actually issued, and that was unusual. Typically, as soon as the survey was done, the grants were issued. There was a lot of red tape involved there. Meanwhile, there were other grants going on a creek called Pleasant Creek. There was a grant made, a large grant, 3,000 acres, in 1786 before the massacre, and in 1801 another grant made after the massacre. But the problem is it was all the same creek. There were grants being processed on what was called Spring Creek and grants being processed on what was called Pleasant Creek, and they overlapped. And that's where we learn a lot about what we know about the Dyers Creek Massacre, is these grants that were supposed to have been done in 1787 but weren't completed till 1789 ends up being overlapping with other grants, probably because the creeks were called different names. We're not sure, but regardless, the people who eventually did settle on this creek were in Stewart County Circuit Court for years, trying to figure out who owned the land along this creek, who had the better title to this land. Fortunately, in the Stewart County archives, we have quite a few court cases where the people who lived along this creek were trying to sort things out. I show you here an excerpt from Brunson versus Cooley in 1813. If you look at the sketch that I've been showing you here of these tracts, there's the spring, here's the Mont Florence tract. William Cooley had purchased this black square. He had purchased that land from someone who had gotten a grant on Pleasant Creek. And unfortunately, because of all the confusion about where the boundaries actually were, he built his house where this red star is showing. So he didn't build his house on his own land. The person whose land he did build his house on sued, and everybody brought their deeds and surveys to court, and the land was resurveyed several times. And figuring this out, I show you actually here one of the surveys that was done in 1813 to try to figure it all out. And it shows you William Cooley's land here, but also shows you where he actually built his house. So he lost that suit and he had to move his house. There were, in another case, Cooley versus Valentine in the 1830s, 166 pages worth of depositions and investigations and surveys trying to figure out who owned the land along this creek that had never been properly surveyed. Questions arose in this court case as to whether, after the attack in 1787, whether the surveys were actually properly completed. So in this case of Cooley versus Valentine, we have quite a few depositions that give us some great detail to add to the history books on what really happened at the Dyers Creek Massacre. Henry Gibson gave a deposition in 1836, and the question was put to him whether or not Anthony Foster, the deputy surveyor, had told Gibson that he made any surveying after he was defeated by the Indians. And Gibson says, no, he never told me that he finished those surveys. I questioned to Gibson, did you hear Foster say that after he ran that first line that he came in and didn't do any more surveying? And Gibson says, yeah, Mr. Foster told me that he couldn't get into the camp because he was one of the ones that got lost. He was very glad he didn't get back into the camp and that he didn't do any more of that survey. Another question to Gibson, don't you believe that many of the surveys, they only went and found the beginning corner in the woods, and then they finished the survey around the fireside, and they were called chimney corner surveys? And Gibson says, yeah, I know because I've done it myself. So here's evidence that early on, because of the problems on the frontier, that sometimes the surveying parties would only find that beginning corner of a survey, and they wouldn't go measure it properly and mark the boundaries properly and finish everything on paper around the fireside. Thomas French gave a deposition in the Cooley versus Valentine case. French had settled very close to the spring. He settled actually on this green rectangle here about 1800, only 13 years after the attack, and he knew some of the surveying party personally. So he says he was informed by the surveyor, Anthony Foster, that the land did connect, that the grants did connect, and that Foster did survey them. But French was not at the massacre, so he does say he doesn't know anything for sure, but he was informed by Nash, who was one of the survivors, and Foster, who survived, who were engaged in the survey, that they had made the beginning corner and had started on the survey, but were surprised by Indians and forced to abandon it and flee into the settlements being Clarksville. Some more evidence in this deposition that these surveys were never properly completed. Another statement made by Thomas French in this lawsuit is something that startled me, and it is, for me, profoundly affected one of the most prevalent families in Stewart County. French says, from the information of Nash, the surveyor, and Foster, and a man by the name of William Wallace, they told me they came to the defeated camp about 10 o'clock one morning and left there for the settlement early the next morning. William Wallace was one of the unnamed chain carriers that had gotten lost the night before with Anthony Foster. And William Wallace is the patriarch of almost every Wallace in Stewart County. He's my ancestor 2 different ways through the Wallace family. So I had never known until I found this that my ancestor, William Wallace, and the patriarch of almost all the Wallaces, was one of the lost chain carriers who came very close to being involved in the Dyers Creek Massacre. William Wallace continued to live in North Carolina. After this, he was actually elected sheriff of Martin County, North Carolina, and he moved along with many of the Wallaces to Stewart County in 1811. At the Stewart County Archives, I just show you this for one of the other pieces of evidence about whether the surveys were done properly or not. This is a North Carolina land grant that we have at the Stewart County Archives to Caleb Pfeiffer, and this says Pleasant Creek. But as we've talked about, Pleasant Creek and Spring Creek were both the same creek, which we now call Dyers Creek. And attached to Caleb Pfeiffer's survey was this plat. Now what I want to call your attention to here is that this is supposed to represent the actual land that Caleb Pfeiffer was being granted on Dyers Creek. And this is supposed to represent Dyers Creek, that squiggle going up. But Dyers Creek doesn't flow south to north, it flows southwest or northeast to southwest. So this to me is evidence that the surveyors were not properly surveying all of the land on this creek. And there was at least some shenanigans, if not some just general laziness going on, or fear that caused them not to survey these things properly. Caleb Pfeiffer in this case never moved to Tennessee. He was one of those many people who held on to the land but never moved here. He paid taxes on it for a while and it went to his sons. But the point here is that that plat of survey bears no resemblance to Dyers Creek Massacre, or to Dyers Creek. Okay, I want to tell you about the location. So I've showed you the plat of these maps. Here's the creek, here's the spring. The key corner of all of these grants was 200 feet or so east of the spring. The spring itself for many years was known as the Willow Spring, but that name has been lost to the ages. In the 1870s, the surrounding land was purchased by George Brandon, and the spring became known as Brandon Spring. Now, Brandon Spring may be familiar to some of you for something that took place there in the 1960s. It was the location of Brandon Springs Trout Farm. And my great uncle Glenn Long was one of the co-owners of that trout farm. I went there quite a few times in my childhood. So the trout farm was built where the spring was, at the Willow Springs. So the location, if you know where Brandon Springs Trout Farm was, that spring is the Willow Spring where the Dyers Creek Massacre took place. The trout farm, if you're not familiar with that location, was located on Dyers Creek, just up the creek from Papa Rock. And I show you here in the red a plat of the Montflorence 1,000-acre tract as it lay. I've got Papa Rock marked there for reference. Got a little fish there marked where the trout farm was. I would warn you that this is on private land. There is a roadway going back to the spring and to the creek that is private land. I'm not even sure who owns it now, so if you have any notions of going to visit the location of the Dyers Creek Massacre, please understand that you are on private land if you're going to do that. And of course, this took place nearly 250 years ago, so there wouldn't be anything to find there, especially since the land has been heavily cultivated over the past 250 years, and certainly because of the trout farm reconfiguring the creek and the spring. I'll ask you a little quiz here. I've shown you here the Montflorence tract and one of the adjoining tracts as they would lay on the land plotted on a modern map. But why are these grants tilted? If you see, they're not lined up north-south to the map. So the reason that they are tilted to the east about 5 degrees is that magnetic north has moved in the past 250 years about 5 degrees. So north's not where it used to be. So if you're trying to plat an old deed on a modern map, you have to tilt it to the east 5 degrees to get it to work out right. I'll remind you of some of the sources that I used in putting together this presentation. The Draper manuscripts were particularly helpful because they gave a great detail of the men who were involved and kind of the blow-by-blow that happened. And then the loose papers of the Circuit Court of the Stewart County Archives is what blew the story open as it relates to William Wallace, one of the lost chain carriers. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Thanks for watching.